Hello, everyone. This is Dominic, and I'm so pleased to be here on the Literary Music Series today. It's a real pleasure this will be my second appearance now. I appeared, I guess, in 2020 with Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, and now, today we'll be talking about Brahms, and specifically his third piano sonata, Opus 5. So, I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California, here in my apartment. And this particular piece of music by Brahms has always meant so much to me because I feel like there's so many things to unpack with it. And since it's such an early work, it's fascinating how it is intertwined with Brahms' own personal life and his development as an artist. Because we're always used to seeing Brahms and his burly self with a big beard, kind of like Santa Claus. But that first opening slide, let's take another look at this picture that I had up there. This is actually Brahms around 1860. So this would have been him in his mid to late 20s. And this sonata that I'll be talking and presenting today was written in 1853. So this is basically how Brahms would have looked around the time of the piece's composition. And of course, this is a 3D rendering by the very fabulous artist Hadi Karimi. So more to come on that. But again, if you have any questions, comments, I'll be happy to answer them. I can see all the comments on my little iPhone right here as you type them. So don't hesitate to interact with me. I'd love to engage with you all. But in any case, I want to talk a bit about, again, Brahms' third piano sonata and introduce it. So again, this piece would have been written in 1853. This was Brahms' Opus 5 sonata. This is a rather early work. Brahms would have been, just 20 years old, actually, when he composed this piece. And it was not without struggle and without, strife. Around this time, around 1853, is when Brahms actually first met the very prolific and, at the time, famous composer Robert Schumann. And here's some pictures of Robert and his wife Clara Schumann. These two are probably the biggest influences on Brahms in general, and at the time, in his early 20s, they really just influenced Brahms so much. As the story goes, a friend of Brahms had always said, Johannes, you must go meet Robert and Clara. They're, the foremost musicians in Germany, and they'll have so much to offer you and so many things. You guys will love each other. Well, Brahms took his advice and mailed in some music to Robert for his perusal, but he never received an answer. So Brahms was a bit miffed, I would say, that he never got a response from Robert. So for a while, Brahms had a chip on his shoulder about this and was reluctant to say nice things or reach out to Robert, as any young upstart in their teenage years would be. But finally, when the two of them when Brahms was in the same city as Robert and Clara during his travels, he decided to finally bite the bullet and go knock on the door of these two individuals. And apparently, the door was answered by a young girl, Clara and Robert's eldest daughter, who told them, Mom and Dad aren't home, come back tomorrow. So Brahms, in a very anticlimactic way, walked home and then came back the next day. And at this meeting, basically Brahms was greeted by Robert in a bathrobe, looking a little bit unkept, but nonetheless graciously welcoming Brahms into their home, into the piano. Brahms promptly began playing his first piano sonata, the first movement, and after about a minute, Robert stopped him and said, Clara must hear this. So then he invited Clara into the room, and the two of them listened to Brahms' first piano sonata, his second piano sonata, his Scherzo, Opus 4 in E-flat minor, and then some of the beginning workings of the third piano sonata. By all accounts, Robert and Clara didn't have much to say. They thanked Brahms for coming and led him to the door. Brahms thought he had failed this introduction to this master, so he felt embarrassed, he felt let down, he felt pretty depressed. But it was to his surprise that the next day Robert said, you must come again. And when Brahms came in, kind of expecting criticism and bad thoughts, Robert and Clara basically said that they were speechless. They had no idea what to say when they first heard Johannes. They thought it was just a miracle, one of the greatest things they'd ever seen and heard. And Robert went so far as to say that Brahms, in his eyes, Brahms was the next Beethoven. He was the future of Germanic, of Western classical music. And he promptly wrote an article in the newspaper a few days after proclaiming this. So things could not have gone better for Brahms at this meeting. And this is really important because while Brahms had already written his first two sonatas as well as his Scherzo Opus 4, this third sonata was a work that, again, he had begun, but he finished it in intimate fashion with Robert. Robert was a composer, one of the foremost respected composers of the time, so Brahms and Robert worked really closely on this piece. Unfortunately, it was only 2 months after meeting and working and completing this piece that Robert, unfortunately, was succumbing to a psychotic episodes, and Robert ended up going to an asylum where he spent the rest of his days. So, by all accounts, Brahms was the happiest he'd ever been when being with Robert and Clara. Brahms came from kind of a broken family, and basically Robert and Clara invited Brahms to stay with them in their large house for a few months, and Brahms did. Every day was filled with music making, music talk, artistic expression, and Brahms always thought of Robert and Clara as being the ideal versions of what a couple, what a musical union could be, and he admired them all throughout his life. For him, seeing Clara, meeting her was also a revelation, because at the time there weren't as many female musicians in Germany, in the world, and Clara was absolutely one of the finest pianists ever, to be blunt. She was the first pianist to really play a piano recital from memory. She was a huge champion of Brahms and Schumann's work, and all throughout his life, Brahms would always seek Clara for advice and for thoughts about his pieces. So while he worked quite a bit with Robert on this sonata, Clara would oftentimes give more pianistic inputs about maybe more technical things, because Clara, of the three, Clara was by far the superior pianist. There was no question about that. She was a virtuoso, while Brahms and Robert were more accomplished pianists, but they were more composers. So, yes, I mean, this would have been perhaps another scene at the piano of Robert and Clara. These are wonderful little old-time photos, I would say, of the two. But the title of this program, Brahms and His Ghosts, what does that really mean? What's going on here? So for me, the reason that I titled it this way is because I find in this sonata, particularly, there's a lot of these influences that Brahms had, both from people like Robert and Clara, but also from past composers. And that's something I'd like to get into, to kind of talk about the ghosts that are maybe haunting Brahms, or influencing Brahms, or inspiring Brahms. Probably the first ghost that influenced Brahms throughout his entire life was this gentleman. We all know him, we all love him, Beethoven. When Brahms was proclaimed the next Beethoven, Brahms took that very hard. He was, of course, flattered, but it was a huge cross to bear. When everyone in Germany is looking at you as sort of a savior, as sort of the next, messiah of classical music, that makes you kind of get in your own head. And Brahms kind of became a perfectionist. He didn't, write. His first symphony wasn't written until he was about 40 years old. And even in his early music, Beethoven is always permeating his thoughts. So let's take a look at some examples of where Beethoven is infiltrating the psychology of Brahms. I'd like to actually take a look at the score. So why don't we just take a look at a few little simple examples I just want to show you about Beethoven's influence. So we have Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, for example. And this rhythm, that rhythm can be found all throughout this sonata, actually, and it's not a coincidence. I mean, we take a look at the very opening of this piece, and looking at the left hand right here, all of these rhythms throughout this piece, in this movement particularly. And this is what we call the fate motive. And here, Brahms is absolutely being inspired by Beethoven. So this first movement, Allegro Maestoso, fast and majestically, it unfolds with a grandiose type nature. And I would say that, listen for that left hand knocking motive, dun 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 dun. It's very subtle, but it's definitely the influence of Beethoven. And there's some really wonderful parts, particularly in the second movement, that I want to talk about. So, in the second movement, Brahms actually writes a poem, and I'd like to just show you guys that poem. He writes these words. He writes, "Through evening shade, the pale moon gleams, while wrapped in love's ecstatic dreams, two hearts are fondly beating." He writes this in German at the onset of this movement. And of course, it's by Otto Inkerman, but in the score it says Sturnau. Sturnau was a pseudonym of Otto. And here we see a really intimate example of Brahms writing music that's really overtly romantic. So let me just show you an example of that. In this piece, in the second movement, we always think about two people conversing. This is kind of what I interpret. The two hearts finally beating, two people in love, two people whispering to each other at night. So an example of that would be most prominently on this page, particularly right here, where we've got two different voices. We have a soprano, we have perhaps a tenor, and we have got these two interlocking type melodies that are absolutely beautiful, and it has this pulsating feeling as these hearts are warmly and generously united. So this movement is really special. I feel like Brahms did develop very strong feelings for Clara Schumann throughout his life, particularly when Robert was committed to the asylum. And Clara was left alone with really no one to talk to about her husband's condition. Brahms was her confidant. The two of them would have really supported one another, as Robert, who is a father figure to Brahms looked at him as a father, as a surrogate father, and for Clara, of course, Robert was her husband. The two of them really consoled each other, and it's a really beautiful thing between these two wonderful people. So this movement in particular is quite special. And then I just wanted to actually talk a little bit about the influence of Mendelssohn on Brahms. And here's a little quick example. And before I forget, here's Mendelssohn, another wonderful rendering by Hadi Karimi. Mendelssohn would have written a piano trio, number 2 in C minor, in 1845, and Brahms would have known about it, because when we listen to the third movement, the Scherzo movement of this sonata, we hear a very similar type figure to the piano trio's last movement. So I want to first, just play briefly this opening figure, this. So it's this upward, really nice figure, and let's listen briefly to the Mendelssohn last movement opening, played by some of my wonderful friends here. So I think you might hear that upward kind of rocket trajectory in this movement. And we also see this fate motive once again. It's coming back time and time again, particularly in this scherzo, particularly right here. All of these things. So Beethoven, the ghost of Beethoven, is always there. And again, in the in the next movement, so this sonata is interesting because now we're at the fourth movement, right? We have the Allegro, we have an Andante, we have a Scherzo, and now the finale. But no, actually we have an Intermezzo now. Intermezzo is a word that Brahms would use all the time in his late music. Intermezzo means in the middle of something. And Brahms calls this an intermezzo, and specifically Rückblick, which means remembrance. And it is a remembrance. It's a minor, sad version of the second movement, actually. It's a sad version of this music. Instead of now it's... So it's kind of this hollow, pale type music that's remembering the beauty of the second movement, but this time it's been transformed into something much more ominous, perhaps. But let's take a look at some more Beethoven. So here we have some wonderful Beethoven. Happens all over the place. This da 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 da. Again, Beethoven's here. And then finally, we get to the final movement, the finale. So here we see a bit of Brahms' Hungarian heritage in this wonderful rhythm. All these, really characterful type dance motives are quite Hungarian. But here we see two influences in this movement. We see the ghost of Johann Sebastian Bach, and as well as a ghost, but also presence of Joseph Joachim, a really famous violinist that would have been the man that told Brahms, meet Robert. This man was the connection between Robert Schumann and Johannes Brahms. And Joseph Joachim actually had a saying that he loved to share with his friends, which was Freier Abend einsam, and it means free but lonely. This was the way that they put this into the music was interesting. They would take the first letter from each word. So in German, F-A-E, and they would these composers, Joachim and Brahms, they would actually write melodies based off of these letters, these notes. So let's take a look. Let's look at an example of that. In this sonata, we see right here we see F A E, and so we've got this beautiful melody, and then it develops. So this is the ghost of Joachim inside of Brahms' sonata. And Brahms is paying homage to both this motto, this saying, as well as his dear friend. And of course, we can't have good German music without the influence of the greatest German composer of all time, Johann Sebastian Bach. So, with great gusto, Brahms actually infuses a sort of Lutheran chorale, specifically right here. This is a very organ-like texture, and for me at least, this is definitely Bach making his presence known. And this piece really ends with jubilation and exaltation. And this chorale theme is transformed into a wonderful, almost fugal type atmosphere. So indeed, kind of like our good friend Bach, but Brahms keeps on propelling the music with more and more motion as it ends with ecstasy, really, I would say. Yes, without further ado, I think that's a brief little introduction to this sonata, number 3, opus 5. Again, it's in 5 movements. This is sort of a symphony for the piano. It's around right under 40 minutes, I would say. It's a hefty piece. And the recording that I made specifically for this event, a very recent recording that I made at the Colburn School, is featuring this piece, and I just want to thank the Colburn School for allowing musicians to continue to make art inside their walls. So I'm really excited to share this performance for the first time. Again, during the performance, feel free to leave comments or questions, because I'll still be here listening along with all of you guys, and when the piece ends, I'll come back on just to chat with you a little bit if you have any questions, or bid you all a good night. But in any case, here is Brahms Sonata Number 3, Opus 5 in F minor. Welcome back. So that was Brahms Sonata No. 3 in F minor. Thank you so much for lots of your comments and your questions, which I'll get to right now. I was also just listening as well as you guys, because for me, regardless of whether I'm playing or not, this type of music, music of these great masters, it always speaks to me just at its core. And I think that great music, however it might be played, you hear that intensity, that intention behind the music. And for me, what's really special about this sonata is that it's one of the even more extroverted type works that Brahms wrote. It has such youthful passion. It's particularly in that second movement, how the music is kind of dying away, but then there's that really, really passionate surge of a coda at the end there. So I always think about Brahms as he wasn't always just some 70-year-old big man, old man. He was a young, viral, man, 20-year-old man when he was writing this, and we really see that here. So I did see some. There was a lot of questions here, and I'm going to get to some of them. I noticed toward the beginning there was a wonderful question that was just pretty simply, what's my favorite piece of Brahms? And that's a really hard question. Brahms is one of my favorite composers. So for my, the bad answer is that whenever I'm playing a Brahms currently is my favorite piece. Everyone goes, tell us actually what it is. Honestly, for me, this sonata is up there. But I must say that as a complete work, I would say his Opus 118 set of 6 pieces is truly an extraordinary experience. Maybe I'll present that in one of the future episodes of this series. But yeah, the Opus 118, there's an immense amount to unpack there. It's a totally different style. For me, this early style of Brahms is actually neglected. Most of the time we hear late Brahms, the late pieces, 118, 117, 119. And we sometimes forget that Brahms also had this other side to him that was wild, that it was youthful, that was passionate. And I love showcasing this side of him as well. And then I saw another question, I think from Natalie, that was about pairing this sonata. So obviously, you guys all can see that I think this sonata, I played it in 37 minutes, but this can be about 40, certainly, quite easily. And what do you play with it? For me, it's I've done a few different combinations that I think are quite fun. If you're doing like a 1-hour recital program, 60 minutes, no intermission, I would say end with the Brahms, but begin with something like, Robert Schumann's Arabesque, Clara Schumann's Romances. Begin with some shorter little works that can also sort of guide us in the right direction, because it's wonderful to circle this sonata with the people that literally witnessed its conception. So I enjoy pairing it with that. And, one of my programs that I really enjoyed was doing Brahms' Third Sonata in the first half, intermission, and then the Liszt B minor sonata on the second half. The reason I like this is because the Liszt sonata was actually written, I believe, right around the same time. I'm not sure if it was 1853, but it was literally, I think it might have been 1853. It was right this year. And there's a really funny story about Brahms being at a home concert of Liszt. Liszt was performing Liszt's B minor sonata, and Brahms was in attendance to see the great virtuoso Liszt. And by all accounts, Brahms actually fell asleep during this performance, and Liszt was a little bit sullen and a little bit hurt by Brahms falling asleep. Some people say Brahms fell asleep because he was tired from the traveling, but Brahms was never a big Liszt fan. The Schumanns and Brahms, they kind of had their own camp, musical camp, which was not. They were allergic to a virtuoso showman type style. Now, the B minor sonata by Liszt is not a showman, style. I would say it's virtuosic, sure, but it is some serious music, and I consider it to be a masterpiece. So, kind of putting these two sonatas of Brahms F minor and Liszt B minor with two composers that maybe don't see eye to eye, I kind of get a little bit of a kick out of that because putting them together, even if they don't want to be together, it's kind of like two magnets, maybe two positive magnets that don't have any. They don't want to be together. So I've had fun with different programming like that. But certainly, it never hurts to throw on, with this piece, usually this will need its own half, literally. So the other half, you can explore, maybe shorter pieces. so that the audience doesn't feel too overwhelmed by too many mountains of repertoire. I also saw some really great questions about the influence of Beethoven on Brahms, the influence of Schubert on Brahms. And this is, of course, absolutely. I mentioned the Fifth Symphony, but Natalie was asking about the last three Beethoven sonatas. But for me, actually, I see... so Brahms was a student of art, a student of history. He always was studying other composers' scores. And, he was even editing them. And basically what that means is that, he would take the music of Francois Couperin, for example, and he would... Who was Francois Couperin? Well, we don't have time for that now, but he was a French Baroque composer, a colleague of Bach's. Bach loved him. They were very, Couperin wrote some really fabulous pieces. But Brahms was a huge fan, performed a lot of Couperin, and he would edit this music. So he edited, some scores of Beethoven, he edited some scores of Schubert and of Couperin. What that means is that he would take the manuscripts, the handwritten, and he would look at it, study it, and transcribe it, for editions. And you can find, the Couperin edition edited by Brahms. Brahms took, particularly with Beethoven. I saw another question. I'll talk about Beethoven really quickly, then I'll move on to Schubert. So with Beethoven, the last three sonatas for sure, there's so many parallels. For me particularly, Natalie was asking about other sonatas that in five movements, and my belief is that Beethoven's Hammerklavier sonata is in five movements. I believe that, the Hammerklavier sonata has the opening, and then the Scherzo, and then it has the slow movement, and then sorry, I'm playing it really fast just to get through it. And then there's actually a movement called Introduction, Introduction and Improvisation. That movement, which I believe is a movement that does transition into the fugue. So, for me, it's that sonata's in five movements, and also we know that Brahms studied Beethoven because Brahms' very first piano sonata, Opus 1. How's that go? Dum dum da da dum dum. Same rhythm as Beethoven's Hammerklavier. Da dum da da. You can't be more explicit than that. That's another example of Brahms borrowing rhythmic devices from Beethoven. As a rule of thumb, if you're ever asking a question, can in music do that? The answer is usually Beethoven. That's a safe bet. Beethoven did everything, literally. There's plenty of string quartets in five movements, but yeah, Beethoven only wrote, in my opinion, one sonata in five movements, which is Hammerklavier. And certainly that the severity of Opus 111, the first movement, I hear that same severity. In the opening of it's the same kind of da-dum, very intense type music. And while there's no quite variations, Beethoven became obsessed with variations and fugues in his later style. Definitely Brahms is. I think for me, what's interesting is that the fact that Beethoven was so inventive and so adventurous with the number of movements, the types of pieces in his late style, I think that kind of let Brahms feel comfortable to also write a five-movement sonata, which you guys might think, what's the big deal? Well, back then, five movements was like, who does that? Everyone does four movements, everyone does three movements. And, for most audiences back then, that extra intermezzo was just a little bit peculiar. So, yeah, I would say that. And about Schubert, yeah, so there's so many things to talk about Schubert. Actually, it's really interesting when you start looking at how composers related to one another. So, Brahms basically has some really wonderful quotes about Schubert. One of them is that Brahms said, "My love for Schubert is a serious one. To put it precisely, it's not a passing fancy." Now, that might seem trivial at first. He's like, of course, you love it. But actually, a lot of composers unjustly thought of Schubert as simply a parlor musician, a parlor pianist, because Schubert would oftentimes only write his music for parties, and he wrote tons of waltzes. And what are waltzes? He'd write 16 bars of music, and then it'd be on a napkin and kind of disappear somewhere. And people didn't take him that seriously. Little did we know, of course, that every one of these waltzes is pure gold. or his songs are pure gold. I mean, heck, there's a quote of Brahms. He says about Schubert again. He says, I remember he was talking to, well, I don't remember, I wasn't there, but there's a letter of Brahms talking to Clara. Clara, of course, being one of the finest pianists of all time and of that century. He was talking to Clara saying, yes, in any Schubert song, there's always something to learn. And I can totally agree with that because during this past pandemic, I've had a lot of time on my hands. Lately, not so much, but at the beginning, I did. And I remember listening to hundreds of Schubert songs. Some of them, most of them, I didn't know. He wrote almost 600. And certainly every single song is unbelievably inventive, I must say. And you think, whoa, what is going on here? And so I definitely see the fact that, Brahms admired Schubert for his songs and that you can learn something. I totally agree because even I was astonished, and I think I'm pretty well listened, but there's so much music out there, so much of Schubert that has not been played or recorded. So yes, he also orchestrated, I believe, 9 or 10 lieder of Schubert's for orchestra. And Schubert was very famous for Landler. Landler were these type of really gracious waltzes, and certainly in the Scherzo, for sure, the trio section. This is definitely a slow Landler type waltz. So we definitely see that, and Natalie, I think also I noticed a comment she made about how it was Stravinsky basically said, I guess good composers, it's like lesser composers borrow, but great composers steal. And what does that mean? It sounds kind of negative, but actually what it means is, when you borrow something, you have to return it, but when you steal something, it's technically yours at that point. You made it your own. For better or for worse, and it's one of those things where yes, I mean when I'm hearing this type of thing in the Brahms, looking at this music, starting from right here. I mean that is Beethoven's influence, rumbling deep, but Brahms makes it his own. So he steals it. He doesn't borrow it. He's not renting it. It's become his own. So that's a great comment from Stravinsky. And then, for me also, Brahms literally would write to Clara saying, we must have all of the sonatas of Schubert. We must look at them all. And they would. They would study every single sonata. Schubert wrote 21 sonatas. Most of us know the last 3, maybe belittling, maybe we know 6 sonatas, give or take. But that's not enough, we need to know all of them. And Schubert wrote so much stuff. So, in doing that, I think that if there's one composer who I think has the most remarkable sense for harmony, it is Schubert. I actually say that without question. There's so many harmonic treasures to find in Schubert, and I think that influenced Brahms. For example, a harmonic change that I hear in the second movement that I think is just probably one of the greatest harmonic changes in this entire piece. But I don't really see as much in Brahms' later style, because this is such a romantic version, is particularly, it occurs right here, in between this bar and this bar, when we have the B-flat minor. That's reminiscent of the way that Schubert moves around his harmonic sense. This is actually a little bit less Beethoven for me and much more Schubertian. And also, again, the king of the dance, the king of the waltz was Schubert. He wrote so many... Schubert was previous, and this is Brahms, and it's that same kind of robust type Viennese song that almost sounds like, almost could be like a drinking song a little bit, because it has that heft to it, deep in the piano. But I mean, when Brahms wrote his very famous collection of waltzes, he actually said that there are two books of waltzes in the Schubertian style. I mean, he literally says that. So, I mean, there's so many examples of Brahms being influenced by Schubert, Beethoven, by all of his predecessors. So, yeah, truly amazing stuff. Let me see. Let's see. Other thoughts. I see. Let me just scroll a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, these are some great questions from everyone already that I noticed during the concert. And thank you very much for the compliments on the production. This video is actually my first production that I did all myself, with the cameras, the audio, and everything. So I recorded everything at the same time, and then kind of pick and choose the different scenes that I kind of look good in, for different moments. So thank you for that. And I see Michael's asking, how long did it take me to learn this piece? I did learn this piece a number of years ago, actually. I remember learning it. This piece might have taken me 2 or 3 weeks to memorize it and get it ready for like a lesson or something. I remember I first played it for Peter Frankel at Yale University, and I'll never forget how he talked about particularly the Scherzo of this piece. Again, people like the word gusto, but the way that Peter Frankel, a real full-blooded Hungarian, plays that opening with just real impetuous type behavior, that's absolutely the character. So I always loved watching him demonstrate that opening, because it's not necessarily supposed to be the fastest type of thing. This thing has to have a lot of heft to it and a very Hungarian style. Yes, I see Jacob's partial to 119. That's a very, very. It's hard to pick, a favorite Brahms piece. It's really hard to pick. Maybe the reason I like 118 more is because there's more of them. There's more Brahms happening. I guess both of them are about 20 minutes anyway. But for me, the thing I love about 118 is just the transformations and the transitions actually that are between the movements, actually, of how Brahms wonderfully, he doesn't intend to, but he actually writes in sort of these transitions where the first movement begins in this A minor type area, but then it ends in A major. It sets up the second movement, and then the third movement sets up the fourth, and so on. And that's I'm just kind of partial to that, at least right now. And yes, Jana, absolutely, playing some Clara Schumann with Brahms is a must, I would say. So that's one of my favorite pairings. And I see Mark asking, did he and others know that they were connecting to people with their works back then? So Mark Anthony Smith is asking about, did he know I guess he's asking, did he know about connecting with people back then? Did he know that he was connecting the dots, I guess, with other artists like Mendelssohn and Beethoven? I would say certainly Brahms knew exactly what he was doing. He was a perfectionist. He was known to destroy more scores, 10 times as many pieces of music as he wrote. So every note that he put down has such intention and purpose. He's a purpose-driven composer. There is not a single note that's wasted. And so when he's writing this music that sounds like other composers, of course it's kind of a lesser type comment to say it sounds like other composers, because I don't believe that. I believe it does sound like Brahms. But I don't want to ruin this piece for you by showing you all these examples and then you start hearing Mendelssohn, Beethoven. But I think that what he's doing is he's just drawing upon these geniuses, these masters. Because, just like I as an artist, I feel so, it's such a gift to spend my days surrounded by genius. I feel like Brahms was the same way, where Brahms would wake up, he'd write his own music. I mean, he was spending time with himself, a genius, but he'd also spend time with Bach, with Beethoven, with Schubert, with Mendelssohn, and when you're surrounded by all these ghosts, they don't necessarily haunt you. It's almost like they're, with Brahms, because he was so inspired, he was so attached to history, to tradition, he was so involved in the Germanic, lifestyle, and he had so much pride for his country. He couldn't help but, as a young man and even as an old man, look at who came before him with reverence, with awe and respect. Brahms would have been the first person to say that he was nothing compared to Bach and Beethoven. And then any of us today would be the first to say, "Hold on, Brahms, you're selling yourself a little short." I mean, arguably, you can stand up pretty tall and against those great composers. Of course, some of us have our preferences, but Brahms was very confident in himself, but also rather humble in many other ways. Let's see. So I see Mark asking, back then, was it competitive to take a score and improve it? As an editor, with Brahms editing music, he wasn't trying to necessarily improve the music. He was just trying to, get it ready for print. And as far as orchestrating, the music of Schubert or such like that, or orchestrating by, working in a piece and writing for orchestra, he wasn't trying to necessarily, impose his will upon these composers. He was trying to show a different side to them. So many composers throughout history, sometimes look at their colleagues and sometimes see that their music is being perhaps neglected or not played as much. And Brahms was one of them that would edit and perform the music not out of a competitive way, but more about an uplifting type way, where he wanted to share Couperin's music. He wanted to share the music of Bach. I mean, we have to always remember that back then we didn't have technology like today, with all these computers, laptops that can show you scores. The only way for people to actually know about this music was for composers to kind of play it. These days, we get this sense of it's competitive or whatever, but back then it's like, oh my God, you're playing my piece, that means so much to me. That's that's great. Or adding these little quotes was not thought of to be improving upon. It was almost more like, I respect you so much that I'm trying to kind of also, hint at your style. So these days, of course, with all these resources, when you start maybe copying or editing other people's stuff, you might feel that way, but back then it was a different philosophy. It was more about more of a communal spirit, which is really to be admired, I would say, as composers tried to uplift one another that they loved and they respected. And I see that Jana was asking, who was Brahms's favorite performer, pianist, and violinist? That's pretty easy to say. I mean, for Brahms's favorite pianist was Clara Schumann, without a doubt. I mean, Brahms always talked about how Clara would play his music better than anyone, really. So she premiered so many of his pieces, and he always asked for her advice. And Brahms' very favorite violinist was, without a doubt, Joseph Joachim, the gentleman that I mentioned earlier. The two of them were, for him, idols and confidants and good friends and people that, kept him in check as well. I mean, they would also let Brahms know when he was being too surly or too grumpy at a dinner party. Brahms was the type of person that you had to be careful what you invited him to, because despite being a genius, he was oftentimes brutally honest and not always the polite dinner guest that people might have wanted. But I think we all agree that we'll cut Brahms some slack on some of his comments. I really appreciate everyone's comments and questions. I mean, they're really fabulous. We're coming up on the hour and a half, I guess, now, and I really enjoyed presenting this program to you today of Brahms' Third Piano Sonata. There's so much stuff to talk about in this piece. There's so many different things that you could delve into and keep on talking about. I see Mark. One last comment about Mark talking about Clara being honored back then. Yes, a great passion of mine is to talk about pianists or composers that were neglected. And Clara Schumann for sure was well respected. One thing that we must remember is that in 1856, I believe, when Robert Schumann passed away, Clara Schumann was left with 7 children and no husband. And at the time, she had been when Robert was alive, she was a housewife taking care of obviously a huge household of children. That was taking up all of her time. But then when Robert passed away, she had to make money, so she actually decided to begin her concert career again. And it's really not talked about much, but she went back to performing, traveling, and working her butt off to make not to make ends meet. She was very successful, so when she played her concerts, she would make all the money to support her family, and she single-handedly raised this massive family, pretty much all by herself, which is something that we sometimes forget about, because one of the reasons that Clara's father was so against, everyone knows about Clara's father not being happy that Clara married Robert. The reason was that Clara's father knew that upon marrying Robert Schumann, Clara would end up, having to kind of put her career to the side. And Clara, unbelievably humble and modest woman. She loved Robert so dearly, and she could care less about her career. She cared about, the love of her life, and that was Robert. And that's something that's really beautiful to think about. That for her, it wasn't about being on stage or having the spotlight on her. For her, it was all about Robert. So I can see why Brahms would look at Clara and Robert as the ideal couple, as the ideal marriage, because they certainly were that. 2 people that challenged each other, 2 people that uplifted each other, 2 people that supported each other, and 2 very, very equally successful people. We have to remember that Robert Schumann had known Clara since she was about 9 years old, and Robert would have been 18. 9-year difference about. And Robert was always amazed that this young, precocious young girl was playing metaphorical piano circles around him. They actually studied piano with the same teacher. Clara's father was their teacher, and Robert was always struggling to play the pieces, and Clara was just learning them in a day and just going off to play outside, and Robert was having to sit inside struggling away. So to say that Robert was always in awe of his wife is something that absolutely can be that can actually be definitely said. So Clara Schumann, as well as another name that I won't talk too much about her for right now because we're running out of time, but another name is Sophie Mentor, dubbed the greatest student of Liszt, Liszt's piano daughter. She was a student of Liszt, but she quickly surpassed that title of the time. When she went off on her own and performed, she was a pianist of great renown. She's a bit more of a virtuoso, a little bit more of a showman than or showwoman than Clara. Clara was a bit more concerned with very serious type music, but Sophie was playing all the great war horse virtuoso pieces of the time, and she lived in a castle and all this type of stuff. So Sophie Mentor had many pieces dedicated to her by Liszt. Liszt would dedicate very difficult pieces to Sophie because he knew that she could play it, and I think that's a great honor to have arguably the greatest virtuoso of time, Franz Liszt, dedicating some of the greatest stuff to you. So sometimes I'll tell people to at the beginning of a sonata, don't always glaze over the dedication of the sonata. Sometimes the dedication, the little print that says dedicated to Sophie Mentor, dedicated to Clara Schumann, that kind of stuff is actually important. A lot of us don't even look at it until we've learned the piece, and years later say, who is that dedicated to? So in this case, this sonata was dedicated to a princess. This was out of a fee. This was out of more of a monetary reason. That this had been commissioned, and Brahms wrote it, to make a living, literally. So let's see. And Jana, that's a great quote. Jana talks about Brahms' violin concerto being written not for the violin, but against the violin. And knowing my friends and their comments about the piece, as much as they might love it, for sure that's an adequate comment. Brahms, he knew how to write for the violin, and he also knew how to write for the piano, but especially in some of his later styles, he could care less what was easy, what was hard. He just wrote what needed to be written. And that's definitely in the same sentiment of Beethoven. Beethoven's early music, as hard as it might be, does fit the hand and the physiology somewhat, but when we start getting to music of the Hammerklavier, the late 110, 111, we start realizing that Beethoven's not writing for the piano anymore. He's writing just for music's sake. He's not limited anymore. And Brahms was the same way. And again, for me, Brahms has qualities that are different and really exemplary compared to Beethoven and Bach. And I know that today I talk a lot about other composers and their influences on Brahms, but I do want to finish by saying that this by no means diminishes Brahms's impact and his influence. Because to be honest, despite the fact that you might say, oh, if he's influenced by Bach and Beethoven, maybe I should go listen to Bach and Beethoven because they're better, because they influence him. But I get things from Brahms that I can't get anywhere else. He gives me melodies, he gives me harmonies, he gives me feelings that I can't find anywhere else in any other composer, and that's the sign of a genius. Again, my last thought about Brahms is that I always think that even with music that is so in a major key, I always feel like Brahms is able to write this music being the most sad things ever. I mean, for example, this passage, the passage right here that's circled. This is in D flat major, but it doesn't feel very happy at all. It feels like some of the most maybe nostalgic, bittersweet music, and I always think that Brahms is the king of that. He's able to imbue this music with such feeling. So, I just want to thank everyone for joining today. Thank you, Natalie, of course, for hosting the literary music series. This is a phenomenal series, and regardless pandemic or not, of course, this was born out of perhaps the pandemic, a virtual platform, but even moving forward past the pandemic, I did this way of sharing with audiences all across the world in this virtual way. I find great meaning and great satisfaction in doing this, and I think that I'm really excited to see where this series takes off. And I know that I'll be following along as an audience member, or I guess sometimes as a performer for future events. But thank you so much, everyone, for being such a wonderful audience. It's getting late out there in New York City, I know. So I hope that you have a great night. And thank you again, Natalie, and the Literary Music Series. Have a good night, everyone.